Heart of a Champion, Part 1, Chapter 1, Page 1. My father's game was golf. He was great at it, too. There's a box full of his trophies in our attic. If he hadn't died, golf would have been my game, too. I would never have played baseball, would never have been best friends with Jimmy Winter. I'd have heard about what happened to him while I was hitting a bucket of balls at Palo Alto Muni to prepare for the high school tournament. But my father did die, and I've spent the last 5 years living and breathing baseball. Most of the time, Jimmy Winter has been by my side. No, that's not right. The right way to say it is I've been by his side. I was born in San Francisco, but I've lived all my life in Redwood City, a boring suburb south of the city. My father was a traveling salesman for IBM. He died 10 years ago when I was 7. He was in a hotel in Los Angeles when he had something like a stroke. He called the lobby for help, but his speech was slurred. The switchboard operator figured he was drunk and ignored him. In the morning, a maid found him dead. It's a horrible way to die, alone in a hotel room, begging for help with people thinking you're just some boozer. People say I look like my father, and I guess I do a little. From old photos, I can tell he was tall and thin and had brown hair like me, but his face was broad and fleshy, and mine is all angles and bones. My mother says that every once in a while I'll do something small, scratch my head or plop down on a chair, and it will be exactly the way he used to do it. I always feel strange when she tells me stuff like that. His blood is in my veins, but I never got to know him. The day of my father's funeral, our next-door neighbor, Mr. Mongolin, crouched to my level and looked me in the eye. "You're the man of the house now, Seth. You have to take care of your mother." I remember my throat going tight and a panicky feeling coming over me. "Yes, sir, I will." I stammered, and I meant it, even though I didn't have a clue how. My mom must have overheard. She flashed Mongolin a dirty look, grabbed me by the arm, and pulled me to a quiet corner. "Seth Barham, you're a little boy," she said. "You don't have to take care of anyone." My mom waited a year before suing the hotel. She told me she waited because it didn't seem right to act like money could replace my father. She said she finally sued because she felt she had to make the people who were responsible feel responsible. The hotel was owned by some huge corporation. They had a team of lawyers and buckets of money. My mother had one lawyer and no money. It took 4 years before the case made it to court. We flew down to LA for the trial. One day I was in my 6th grade classroom at St. Pius diagramming sentences. The next I was on a jet plane with my mother and grandmother. I thought it would be exciting, but the courtroom was not fun. On a table in front of the jury was a model of a human head. The doctors used it to explain how my father died. I'm not stupid. I knew it wasn't my father's head, but that model looked so real it scared me. And the way the doctors picked sections out, turned them over, pointed to this vein and that artery, I still have nightmares about it. On the 3rd day of testimony, something went wrong and the judge declared a mistrial. Then the corporation offered to settle. We flew back to San Francisco and took a taxi home. My mother wanted to talk to my grandmother, so I was sent outside. I remember feeling disappointed, and as I closed the front door, I was back in Redwood City, and it was like nothing had changed. Whenever I'd ask my mother questions about my father, she described him as a saint, a perfect husband and a father. I don't blame her. What else could she do? But I didn't have a strong sense of who he was. I'd hoped to learn from the trial what he was really like, good and bad. But to the doctors and the lawyers, my father was nothing but bones and blood and tissue. I hadn't learned anything. I stood on the front lawn that day, wondering what to do, where to go. Guys from St. Pius lived in the neighborhood. I wasn't best friends with any of them, but I showed up at Briarfield Park. I could usually hook up with somebody. But that day I didn't feel much like seeing the guys from the neighborhood. I didn't want to talk about where I'd been. I didn't want to think about that model on the table, so I walked a half a mile to Henry Ford School. I didn't know anybody who went to Henry Ford. Once I reached the playground, I climbed onto the swing, pushed off, and started pumping. When I was soaring, I jumped out into the sand as far as I could. The whole time I was pretending I was a fighter pilot, one of the Blue Angels parachuting from a smoking jet. It's a dumb thing for a 6th grader to do, but that's what I did. I'd have been there about a half an hour when I heard a man's voice boom across the playground. "Use your new glove, Jimmy. You need to break it in before the season starts." "But the new one hurts my hand," I said to use this new one. That was the first time I saw Jimmy. He was about my age, but a little taller than me, a little stockier, and his hair was maybe a little darker brown than mine. Other than that, we looked alike. Over the years, people have sometimes mistaken us for brothers. The Super Bowl was 1 week away, but Jimmy was geared up for baseball, and I mean geared up. He had on a Giants cap, jersey, and pants. He wore orange wristbands and black cleated shoes. He even had flip-up sunglasses. I had a glove, but baseball had never been my favorite sport. All you did was stand around waiting for something to happen, but nothing much ever did. I hadn't even gone out for Little League. But watching Jimmy play catch opened my eyes to the game. His arm was loose and free, and as he released the ball, he'd snap his wrist down and through. The ball would cut through the air like a frozen rope and smack into his father's glove. His father would fire it back. While the ball was in the air, Jimmy acted like he didn't know it was coming, but at the last second, his glove would flick out and snare it. Once they'd warmed up, Jimmy's father hit him some grounders. Whenever anybody had hit a grounder at me, I'd stab at the ball, my eyes half closed, afraid of taking it in the face. Not Jimmy. He'd glide over, glove down in the dirt, scoop up the ball, and toss it back. Then he'd pound his fist into his glove, ready for the next one. Jimmy was a better fielder than any player at St. Pius, but listening to his father, you'd think he was terrible. Use 2 hands. Keep your glove down. Don't let the ball play you. A guy at school, Mike Dokes, had a father like that. Mike Dokes would scream at the refs and coaches during the basketball games. But mostly, he screamed at Mike. As I sat on the swing, I wondered whether it was better to have a father like that or to not have a father at all. Just then, Jimmy's father hit a ball over Jimmy's head that rolled out toward me. I slipped off the swing and tossed it back. "I've got an extra glove," Jimmy said as he fixed me with his fierce green eyes. "You want to play?" They put me at second base so Jimmy could practice the throw, starting a double play. Mr. Winter would hit a grounder to Jimmy. He'd field the ball, and depending on where he was, he'd either fire it or flip it to me on the bag. After 25 grounders or so, Mr. Winter called out, "One more!" Then he smacked a rocket at Jimmy. For the first time, Jimmy backed off, and the ball screamed by him. His father came unglued. "That was a gutless play. A minor leaguer's play. You get a bruise on your chest and it goes away, but if a run scores because you let a ball get by, that run stays on the scoreboard forever." Jimmy's shoulders sagged and the color drained out of his face. I found myself shaking. "Try it again," his father yelled. "Yes, sir," Jimmy answered. Mr. Winter laced another grounder even harder than the one before. Jimmy took it off his chest. "That's better," his father said, nodding. I looked over at Jimmy. He had to have been in pain, but his eyes were shining with pride. Mr. Winter pointed his bat at me. "Now it's your turn, son. Just field the ball and throw it to Jimmy, okay?" I was terrified waiting for that first grounder, but when the ball came, it was just a little roller. I fielded it okay, but my feet were tangled when I made my throw. The ball flew out about 20 feet over Jimmy's head. Instead of going into a rage, Mr. Winter smiled. "Kid," he said, "let's take it one step at a time." For the next half an hour, Mr. Winter showed me how to field a ground ball, set my feet, and throw. He didn't yell once or act bored or make me feel stupid. After that, he had Jimmy and me fly balls and pop-ups. It was the same thing again. Mr. Winter got all over Jimmy if he made the slightest mistake, but he never barked at me. He treated me 1,000 times better than he treated his own son, which is one of those things that makes no sense at all, but is true anyway. Finally, Mr. Winter called, "That's it, boys." After Jimmy and I had loaded the equipment into the trunk, Mr. Winter opened a cooler he'd pulled from the back seat. He leaned against the car and drank a beer while we sat behind the backstop and split a Coke. "What do you think of my father?" It was the one thing I'd hoped Jimmy wouldn't ask, and it was the first thing he said. I looked at the ground. "He's okay." Jimmy frowned. "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking he's mean. But he isn't. He wants what's best for me. My dad made it to AAA ball. He says that with a harder push from his father, he could have reached the majors. He's giving me that push, and I'm going all the way to the major leagues." Jimmy took a sip of Coke. "What's your father like?" he asked. "My father is dead." "Really? How'd he die?" I told him what had happened. "I can't imagine not having a dad," he said when I'd finished. "It's not so bad. I've got my mother." Jimmy picked up a pebble and threw it. "My mom doesn't understand my dad. They argue a lot." Mr. Winter called out that it was time to go. Jimmy stood. "What are you doing next Saturday?" "Nothing much," I said. "Come here, we can play some more." "Maybe," I answered. He started off, but after he'd gone about 5 steps, he turned back. "I'm sorry about what happened to your dad," he said. Chapter 3. I'd missed a week of school because of the trial, but when I returned, nobody asked me where I'd been. I knew they knew, though, because they all went out of their way to be nice to me. Girls who'd hardly talked to me were lending me pencils. Teachers told me I could take my time making up my assignments, but not one person came right out and said he was sorry. Maybe that's why I thought about Jimmy so much during that week. When Saturday morning rolled around, I had headed straight to Henry Ford. I was half a block away when Jimmy started calling my name and waving. It was like we'd been best friends for years. That day, the 3 of us played pickle, a base running game. The guy in the pickle would just keep running back and forth from first to second, second to first, until he was caught and tagged out. Whoever made the tag would take his place. Jimmy had a quick first step, and he had baseball smarts. I didn't have either. So it always seemed like he took off when I was sure he wasn't running, and like he'd hug the bag when I was certain he was going. He stole base after base. Once he slid into me so hard I flipped in the air and landed flat on my back. He didn't apologize or even help me up. Mr. Winter came over. I figured he was going to give me a hand, but he didn't. You were out of position, Seth, he said. You'll get hurt if you don't play right. Then he explained what I should have done. Later, Mr. Winter had us take turns hitting. Jimmy had a pure swing. Even then, every ball was scorched. But hitting the ball hard wasn't enough for Mr. Winter. Take outside pitches to the right, he'd say. Drive this one up the middle. Turn on fastballs on the inside part of the plate. He had Jimmy using every inch of the field. I should know. I had to chase the balls down. I'd never been able to hit a baseball well. I figured it was because I'm not real strong, but Mr. Winter told me I was swinging with my arms. Start with your weight back. As you swing, firm up your left side and drive through the ball with your legs. Line drives and hard ground balls, that's what you want. Fly balls look prettier, but 9 times out of 10 they end up dying in somebody's glove. Around 4 o'clock we stopped. Mr. Winter drank his beer while Jimmy and I had our Cokes. I was tired, but it was a good tired feeling until Jimmy started in. Listen to my father, he said. Listen and you'll learn a whole lot really fast. I listened, I said. Jimmy shook his head. Not hard enough. You've got to pay more attention. He knows everything about baseball. Your father isn't God, I snapped. After that, we sat in silence until Mr. Winter called that it was time for Jimmy to leave. Jimmy stood. I'll see you tomorrow, won't I? There was something desperate about the way he asked. Yeah, I said. I'll be here. Chapter 4, page 10. The next day I was at Henry Ford at noon sharp, and so was Jimmy. I was looking forward to a long afternoon playing baseball, but that was Super Bowl Sunday, and Mr. Winter had a $100 bet on the game. We'd hardly started when he called it quits. Can Seth at least come over, Jimmy asked. Fine by me, said his father. I'll have to check with my mom. I said. You can call her from our house, Jimmy said. Tell her I'll give you a ride home, Mr. Winter added. Jimmy lived on Massachusetts Avenue, in a house exactly like mine. That may sound weird, but there must be 1,000 homes in Redwood City exactly like mine. After I called my mother, Jimmy pulled 2 peanut butter sandwiches out of the refrigerator. My mom made these this morning. She goes out whenever my dad watches football. She says he's too loud. Mr. Winter came in for beer. You boys want to watch the game with me? Jimmy shook his head. I'm going to show Seth my baseball stuff. He looked at me. Unless you want to watch the game. No, I said. I'd rather look at your stuff. Jimmy had the same room in his house that I had in mine. First door down the hall on the right, but nothing else was the same. My room was boring. I didn't know it until I saw Jimmy's, but it was. My walls were white, my bedspread was white, my curtains were white. I had a stupid picture of Mount Shasta above my bed. Jimmy had pennants of baseball teams on the ceiling. His bedspread had the logo of the San Francisco Giants on it. The design on the carpet was of a baseball diamond. The walls were covered with posters of ball players. I stared, my mouth wide open. Who are these guys? If he had been anybody else, I probably wouldn't have asked, but you can tell if a guy is going to make you feel dumb, even if you don't know him much, and Jimmy wasn't that kind of guy. Jimmy pointed them out one at a time. That's Willie Mays. He did it all. He hit home runs, hit for average, stole bases, and played a great center field. Next to Mays is Juan Mariarkle. He had a high leg kick and a mean screwball. Opposite Mariarkle is Willie McCovey. In the 7th game of the 1962 World Series, Jimmy circled his room telling me stories about each of the players. From his desk, I picked up a photograph of an old-time player. I thought the guy looked stupid with his tiny glove and his baggy uniform. I laughed. Who's this? I'll never forget the look on Jimmy's face as he grabbed the picture out of my hand. That's Honus Wagner. He was the greatest shortstop ever. He had a .329 lifetime batting average. He signed a contract in 1908 for $10,000 a year and played 21 years without asking for a raise. Jimmy paused. I'm going to be like Honus Wagner. He plopped onto the floor and pulled out a huge stack of tattered, dirty baseball cards from the nightstand. I sat down next to him. Who do you think was better, Stan Musial or Ted Williams? He asked. I don't know, I answered, which was true enough since I had barely heard of either of them. Jimmy held out Musial's card to me. A lot of people think Williams was, but I don't. Musial hustled more singles into doubles, more doubles into triples, and look what he hit in 1957. Jimmy pointed to a number on the back of the card. He was 36 years old, but he should have won the MVP award that year. Jimmy talked baseball the whole afternoon, earned run averages, slugging percentages, walks to strikeout ratios. It was all new to me, but I wasn't bored. They say that baseball is like a fever, and that once you catch it, you never recover. That day, I caught it. When I looked back at the clock, it was 5:15. I told my mother I'd be home by 5. I've got to go, I said. Jimmy picked out a dozen of the baseball cards he'd spread over the floor. You can have these if you want. Thanks, I said, as I took those cards out of his hand. I could feel how hard it was for Jimmy to give them away. In the living room, Mr. Winter was stretched out on the sofa, a beer in his hand and a slew of empties on the floor. Dad, Seth's got to go home now. Mr. Winter groaned. Can't he wait till the game's over? I looked at Jimmy. I was already late. Dad, Jimmy insisted, you said you'd take him home. Driving to my house, Mr. Winter kept spinning the radio dial trying to get the game. He was speeding too and hardly slowed down at stop signs. You can let me off here, I said once he reached my block. I was barely out the door before he sped off. I didn't even have time to thank him. The whole week I went back and forth between being eager to see Jimmy again and being afraid to see his father. But when Saturday rolled around and Mr. Winter saw me, he smiled. You look a little sleepy, Seth. A game of pepper will wake you up. Chapter 5, page 13. I've been playing baseball with Jimmy and his father every weekend for about a month. When my mother noticed I wasn't taking my glove along. Mine's too small, I explained. I used Jimmy's old one. Seth, she said a little angrily, we aren't poor. So after dinner, we drove to 5 Point Sports. A Wilson glove was on sale. It's okay, the salesman said, but if your son is a serious baseball player, I'd recommend this Rawlings. He held up a burgundy-colored model that cost twice as much. My mother turned to me. Are you a serious baseball player? I nodded. She looked at the price tag again, frowned, then broke into a smile. You're just like your father. He always had to have the best, too. She turned back to the salesman. We'll take the Rawlings and a couple of baseballs and a bat. The salesman tried to talk me into a light bat, but I went for one like Jimmy's. Before we reached the checkout counter, my mother asked if I needed anything else. I'd seen a Giants jersey like the one Jimmy had worn, and they had sweatpants and caps and wristbands and rubber-cleated shoes. I'd even spotted the flip-up sunglasses. By the cash register was a packet of team pennants like the ones Jimmy had hanging in his room. Not really, I answered. She could tell I was holding back. Here's $20, but you're not getting any more. I grabbed the pennants, the cap, and the wristbands. Before I got into bed that night, I spent 10 minutes rubbing saddle soap into my new glove, and after that I lay on my bed and pounded my baseball into the pocket again and again. That's what Jimmy told me he did every night. He said all major leaguers did the same thing, and it worked. With every throw, I could feel the leather softening up, the pocket beginning to form. I finally fell asleep, but I didn't dream about baseball. Instead, I dreamed I was playing golf on a bright, sunny day. In the dream, I pulled a 7-iron from my bag, took an easy practice swing, and then hit the ball. It flew up and up, high against the blue sky, cleared a sand trap, bit as it landed on the green, and settled in no more than 10 feet from the pin. But the golf shot isn't why I remember the dream. I remember it because off to the side of the fairway, almost hidden by an eucalyptus tree, stood my father. He didn't say anything to me, and I didn't say anything to him, but he was watching me. Jimmy told me about Little League sign-ups. He'd made the major leagues the year before. He played shortstop and batted third for the Woodside Plaza Merchants. He didn't have to try out, but I did. He had it worked out. I'd get assigned to his team, play second base. We'd be a great double play combo. He'd bat third and lead the league in hitting and runs batted in. I'd bat second and lead in runs scored. Our team would win the title. It sounded great to me. On the day of the tryouts, there were probably 100 guys at Red Morton Park. Some man took my name, pinned a number on my back, and asked how old I was and whether I wanted to play infield or outfield. I'm 12, I said, and I want to play infield. Over there. They called numbers one by one. Each guy took 5 ground balls, every one a little harder than the one before. The last ball was really stroked. I watched about 10 guys before my number was called. My hands were shaking. That's how nervous I was. The first ball was a simple 2-hopper, but I bobbled it. The next 2 I handled okay, but I had a bad jump on the 4th, and the ball slipped through. I could see the man make a mark on his clipboard. I had to field the last ball cleanly. I had to. The coach swung. The ball exploded off the bat. I froze, unsure whether to step forward and try to take it off my shoe tops or to back up and field it on the bounce. The ball short-hopped me, skidded off the heel of my glove, and nailed me square in the right eye. The coach hustled out. You okay? Yeah, I'm fine. I had my head down, trying to hide my face, but he made me look up. Then he grimaced. That eye needs an ice pack. Your parents might even want to call a doctor and look at it. But what about my tryout? I asked as he led me off the field. I've got to be on the Woodside Plaza Merchants. He patted me on the back. Don't worry. We'll assign you to your team. Your eye comes first. He had me call home, and my mother picked me up about 15 minutes later. By the time we reached our house, I could open my eye only halfway, and I had the worst headache of my life. Sunday morning, my eye was swollen shut. I didn't want to go, but I forced myself to walk over to Henry Ford. Jimmy's face fell when I told him what happened. Did you tell them you have to be on the Woodside Plaza Merchants? Yeah, I said, but I don't think it's going to work. Mr. Winter came over. That's a nasty shiner, Seth. What happened? I told the story again. Mr. Winter listened, then turned to Jimmy. Well, son, let's get to it. It won't be as much fun without Seth, but you can still get in some practice. On Wednesday, team assignments were posted. My mother drove me to the rec center. My eye was still a little swollen, so I had trouble finding my name on the long white sheet of paper. When I finally found it, I was crushed. They stuck me on Eng's Palace Mets, a minor league team. That night, I moped through dinner. Look, Seth, my mother finally said, I know you want to be on the same team as your friend, but Jimmy's been playing for years. You've only been playing for a few months. You can't expect to be as good as he is, not without a lot of practice. I slumped down in my chair. I know, but how am I going to get practice? Nobody else on the block plays baseball. Jimmy's got his father, but I stopped cold. The words had spilled out. We both sat perfectly still for a long moment. It's a moment we have every once in a while when both of us feel my father's absence. I never know when those moments are going to come. If I did, I'd stop them because I hate them. I hate the way my mother raises her chin and bites down on her jaw, and I hate the way my own heart pounds. It's like we're both paralyzed, like we both want to say something, but there is absolutely nothing to say. Finally, I started clearing the dishes from the table. It's okay, Mom, I said once I got my hands in the soapy water. I'll think of something, and the minors won't be so bad. Chapter 7, page 17. After school the next day, I grabbed my glove, my bat, and my ball, and shuffled into the backyard. I started by working on my batting stroke. I swung over and over, making sure I kept my head down and the bat level. But after 25 swings, I stopped. Mr. Winter said if you swing too many times, you swing too hard and end up with bad habits. I plopped down under our cherry tree, feeling defeated. I wanted to be a good fielder, but how could I get better without somebody to hit balls to me? I was about to go back inside when an idea came to me. Tennis players hit the ball against a wall for practice. I couldn't throw a hard ball against the back of the house, but I could throw a rubber ball. It wouldn't be exactly right, but it would be better than nothing. I scrounged around in the garage until I found a rubber ball I'd gotten in my Christmas stocking but had never used. My scheme worked pretty well. If I whipped the ball on a fly against the house, it would ricochet back and give me practice with grounders. If I bounced the ball, it would return as a line drive or a pop-up. I could angle the throws to practice going right and left. After a while, I started aiming at the spot where the house and the ground met. That way, I wouldn't know whether to expect a grounder or a line drive. I'd have to be ready for anything, like in a real game. Our lawn was a little ragged, and that meant bad hops. At the time, those bad hops made me mad. I'd have fielded 10 or 12 in a row without an error, and then the ball would catch on a hole in the lawn and go off my glove, breaking my streak. But the uneven grass taught me to keep my glove down and my eye on the ball. When my mother came home from work, she heard the ball pounding against the house and came to the backyard to investigate. Does that work? She asked. Yeah, I said. It's okay. I followed her eyes as she stared at the back of the house. There were dozens of black smudges where the ball had hit the wall. I expected her to tell me to quit, but she didn't. At the end of the summer, you'll have to paint that section, was all she said. We ate dinner about half an hour later. Once we'd finished, she told me to let the dishes soak. I'll throw you some grounders with a real baseball if you'd like. You don't have to, I said. I'd like to, she answered. Your old mom could use some exercise. She threw me grounders for 10 minutes or so. I'd field them and roll them back to her. Throw it as hard as you can, I told her, and she got some zip on them. My mother threw me grounders every night during baseball season, and during the next season too. And she would have kept doing it even when I was in high school if I'd wanted. When your father dies, people want to feel sorry for you. They want to say you've missed out. And maybe I have missed out on some things, but lots of guys have fathers who never have thrown them a ground ball in their lives. They say they're too busy, that they have work. My mother worked full-time as a clerk for San Mateo County, and she cooked and cleaned and kept house and all that stuff, but she found time for me. One Saturday, Jimmy asked me to go with him and his father to a Giants game. They're playing the Padres, and it's cap night, too. I asked my mother. Let me call Mr. Winter and get a few details, she said. I'd never been to a major league game, and as she talked with Mr. Winter, I was afraid there'd be some reason why I couldn't go. But when she hung up, she smiled. Have fun. My mother never drove fast, but on the way to the game, Mr. Winter roared past other cars on the Bayshore Freeway. I kept expecting a cop to stop us, but none did. When we reached Candlestick, Mr. Winter parked in the first lot. He looked at the signposts, P11. I'm counting on you boys to remember that. We found the right entrance and gave our tickets to the usher. Inside, a little man was passing out Giants caps. I stuck mine on my head. I'll never forget entering a major league park for the first time. The field seemed so big, the chalk so white, the grass so green, and the thousands and thousands of seats filling with fans, buzzing with excitement and tension. Bits of baseball conversation floated by. Radios were turned to the pregame show. This was the real thing, the big show. Looking down on the field, I dreamed of being out there myself. It was a crazy dream for a guy who hadn't even made the majors in Little League, but I dreamed it anyway. As soon as we were settled, Mr. Winter stood. I'm going to get myself a beer before the game starts. You boys want some hot dogs and Coke? I handed him the money my mother had given me for treats, but he handed it right back to me. In the early innings, I tried to talk to Jimmy, but he barely answered. He was leaning toward his father so he could hear the explanations Mr. Winter gave from almost every play. Jimmy's face was tight and twisted, like he was in a math class and wasn't understanding what the teacher was saying. By the top of the third, I gave up even trying to talk. The Giants were behind 4-0, and that didn't help my mood either. In the fifth, Mr. Winter got himself another beer and us more hot dogs. Then the night had turned cold. I was glad my mother had made me bring a jacket. By the bottom of the sixth, the Giants still hadn't scored a run, and some teenagers behind us started booing them. Fairweather fans, Mr. Winter said, looking over his shoulder. They're the worst. In the top of the seventh, the Padres' leadoff hitter smacked a hard grounder down the third base line. Kevin Mitchell made a nice stop behind the bag, but threw the ball away. Maybe that rattled Dave Dravecky, the Giants' hurler, because the next pitch he gave up a 2-run homer to Benito Santiago. The hitter after that walked, and the guy after him doubled. By the time the top of the seventh was over, the Padres led 8-0. We stood for the seventh inning stretch. Mr. Winter bought himself another beer. Come on, you can do it, he yelled as the leadoff hitter stepped in. The teenagers behind us laughed. Yeah, you can do it, one of them yelled. You could strike out, you piece of crap. Mr. Winter faced around. Watch your language. As soon as Mr. Winter turned back, the whole bunch razzed him. Ooh, Mr. Tough Guy, they mocked. Mr. Winter pretended not to hear, but he was mad. He didn't clap, not even when the Giants rallied for 4 runs and loaded the bases with 2 down for Will Clark. The whole place was rocking. Jimmy and I yelled and stomped our feet. The count went full. Everyone was standing. The Padre pitcher wound up, delivered. Clark swung and missed. Around us, people picked up their stuff and headed for the exits. As the Giants took the field in the top of the 8th, the high school kids really ripped into them, and crap was about the nicest word they used. Finally, Mr. Winter couldn't take it anymore. He wheeled around to say something, but as he did, he knocked his beer onto Jimmy and me. Can't you hold your booze, old man? One of the teenagers called down. Why, you. Mr. Winter started to climb over the seat. I really think he would have gone after them if an usher hadn't come up. The usher talked to the fans around us, then made the teenagers leave. We sat, totally silent, through the bottom of the 8th. After the third out, Mr. Winter told us to pack up our stuff. I want to beat the traffic. We're at P11, I said in the parking lot. D11, Mr. Winter snarled. No, it's P11, isn't it, Jimmy? It's P11, Dad. Both of you, shut up. I don't know how Jimmy felt, but I was close to tears. My mother never told me to shut up. She just didn't talk that way. By the time we found the car and drove home, it was after 11. My mother made me hot chocolate and had me tell her about the game. I pretended I'd had a great time. I didn't want to bring up the high school kids, but she smelled the beer on my coat, so I had to explain what happened. She didn't say anything or seem angry, though she did make me shower. The next morning at breakfast, she gave me the news. You're not going to any more games with Mr. Winter. Why? I asked. For a long time she wouldn't tell me, but I kept after her. Finally, she said she didn't want me in a car with a man who'd been drinking. I told her that Mr. Winter had only had 3 beers and that most of the men at the ballpark drank beer, but she wouldn't back down. The whole thing came up one more time, with Jimmy. My father wasn't drunk at the game, he said, his green eyes flashing as we sat by ourselves sipping Cokes on that Saturday. Who said he was? I answered. Jimmy stared at me. You didn't say it, but I know you were thinking it. I wasn't thinking it. Jimmy looked up. Good, because he wasn't. He paused. I could feel the anger go out of him. My dad feels bad about yelling at you. He won't ever say he's sorry. He'd never do that, but he feels bad. I know he does.